My name's Felix, and I'm a carbon addict. Um, I I say I'm a carbon addict, but actually I'm addicted to more. You can give me anything in the world, and I can consume it in an unhealthy way, or I can do it in an unhealthy way. And I came into this room, or I came, sorry, into the rooms of various 12-step fellowships because I could not stop putting copious amounts of white powder into my nose. And I couldn't stop smoking joints on a daily basis. And I could not stop drinking. And I could not stop behaving in a very toxic way with when it came to sexual relations. But again, my journey in recovery, which started on March 17th of 2014, when I stopped smoking cigarettes, smoking weed, sniffing cocaine, and drinking alcohol on that day. And I haven't had any of those substances since then. That journey has been actually a long, it feels like it's been a long game of whack-a-mole, because every time I thought that I had figured something out, that I had figured out that I was addicted to this, I became aware of my addiction to something else. And so I realized that I was addicted to sex, relationships, work, sugar, sports, and on and on and on and went. And for a long time, I thought that I had figured out the underlying, the primal addiction. I thought that was sugar. That was the thing that I could not stop doing. But eventually, I've come to the conclusion in the past 2 years, that actually, like, my real primal addiction is carbon. Now, some argue that I met a plant geneticist in Kansas who founded something called the Land Institute. And he told me, well, life on Earth is a struggle for energy-rich carbon. You know, you put deer on a closed field without predators, and they will graze themselves to death. And if you put bacteria on a sugar-laden Petri dish, they will go for the sugar. This is what we do. But clearly, as we all know in this room, you know, we're far too good at it for our own good. I started. I can see in my childhood there were things about in my behavior that where you could. I now can see addiction in those patterns of behavior that I had, that I exhibited at a very young age. I was very impatient. I was never in the now. I collected things compulsively. I was very obsessive in the way I thought. Very very impatient, and eventually I ended up I remember that I was scared shitless of being alone with my own thoughts. I remember that what freaked me out the most from a very young age was the moment right before you go to sleep. Couldn't deal with that. And when I discovered weed when I was 13 years old, I just thought this is the magic. This is it. I don't ever have to go through those absolutely frightening seconds and minutes and sometimes hours that I had to deal with. I could just smoke a joint and that was that. And yeah, and eventually I tried other drugs, and I didn't realize that I was I never thought that I was towards the end it became obvious that I was an addict, that I had a real problem. But it took really it most of the time I was either extraordinarily insecure and full of fear. I was just like so scared that I pretended to not be scared, and I when I was an adolescent, I ran around with a knife. I was very violent verbally, and then I would whip out my knife. But I did that because I was scared shitless of getting my ass kicked. And the other thing was the only other mode that I knew was convincing myself that I was a genius. There was nothing in between. I was either like the biggest loser in the universe or a genius. And that mix of self-loathing and narcissistic megalomania just became worse and worse and worse. And I ended up becoming an advisor to politicians and to a number of heads of state around the world, in Latin America, in Asia, and in Europe, and to some like CEOs of very, very large companies, some of the biggest companies in the world, and because I evolved in that world, I couldn't believe that I was an addict, because for me, addicts were people in the gutter or in crack houses who were, sucking on a crack pipe or shooting up heroin. I was doing cocaine, but I was doing it in the presidential palace of this or that country, so I thought I was just really slick, not an addict. And so for many years, that's how I rationalized that I could not be an addict. And then when I got into recovery, I started seeing that the next question was like, how incredible that I could go on doing so much doing so much drugs while advising people to, about various things, and some very powerful people. And eventually, like, my take on it now is that actually one of the reasons that I evolved in those circles, or I don't know if it's one of the reasons, but I think I evolved in the fact that I evolved in those circles was consubstantial with the fact that I was an addict. Those things went absolutely together. Not just the narcissistic megalomania that I found in those circles, but because the rush of adrenaline was exactly the same thing. So as I said, I'm addicted to more. You can give me anything, and I can use it or do it in a very unhealthy way. I can do it with salad. I'm also addicted to stories. I like really nice stories about incredible people who do incredible things, and eventually they, the hero journey that we've all heard about. That, like, I love that. I'm looking for it all the time. I catch myself looking for it when I interview people for the books that I write. I'm always looking for that story. Oh, this guy is this the exceptional person that's going to allow me to show that, that certain humans change the world while most of us don't. I went from trying to be that guy to trying to find the people who could be that person. And I guess I'm not gonna go on for too long, but what I would like to say now, talk about a bit now before I hand it back over to Dougal, is what I've learned in recovery. Try to characterize it. I wanted to get fixed in recovery. I thought, like, all I needed to do is to not put copious amounts of white powder up my nose, not smoke joints, not drink alcohol, and pretty much I was good. And what I learned in recovery is, no, I needed to change every single thing that I thought, every single thing that I did. And that it wasn't about thinking. The rooms of AA and other 12-step fellowships are filled with pretty smart people. And that those smarts have zero impact on their ability to stop doing the destructive shit that they were doing. It's not a program for rocket scientists, but it's not about smarts. What we say in the fellowship that I go to the most is, you can't think yourself into healthy behavior. You have to act yourself into healthy thinking. There is no, I converted to Islam a long time ago. My journey in recovery is about, every day I'll talk to someone about it and they will say, oh, you got over that. And no, actually, I haven't, and I won't ever. And the knowledge of that is what saves my ass. The reason I mentioned Islam is because in Islam, we use the expression jihad, the daily, the struggle that we lead to change, to become, to do basically the next right thing throughout our day. That is the only thing that I have to move forward in recovery. And sometimes I'm not moving in the right direction. But this thing that, I've spent a lot of time, as I'm sure most of us here, trying to figure out, what is it, like, how do you explain the discrepancy between what we know, what the data we keep getting on a daily basis about what's happening to this planet and what we're doing. And for me, there's simply no better explanation to look at that, to understand that gap, than the prism of addiction. It's the only thing for me that works, because the way I am dealing with my carbon addiction is very similar to the way heroin addicts are relating to heroin. It's not, I hear that I shouldn't do XYZ, and then I just do it. And yeah, I think that, in a way, addiction is It's what happens. Often addicts are people who can't reconcile the way they see themselves and how they should be and the truth of who they are and the way they behave. When that gap becomes too big, we addicts, we go back to using. And someone told me recently, or not that recently, but a while ago, someone told me, you know, one way of describing good recovery is to do on a regular basis what you don't want to do. And that sounds to me a lot like just being a grown-up. And addicts are, you know, one of the characteristics of addicts is that they're deeply immature people. We say that we have the age that we had when we started using our substance of choice in an unhealthy way. So I'm 45, but the reality is that I am 19, emotionally speaking. And that's I think there's a lot of truth to that. You know, we've become, and this is I'm going to end on this because I know Dougal has much to say on this subject, but Vanessa shared with us a while back a video of an activist in the Black Lives Matter movement who said, who was talking about the immaturity of the lack of awareness of some people of what it is to live in the shoes of racialized people and how they, anyway, and I feel like we've become a civilization or a culture, to use a better term, of unendearing toddlers. You know, toddlers are cute, but we don't have that. So yeah, I hope this helps. Thank you.
Thank you, Felix. And thank you for bringing a flavor as well of the nature of the sharing that is part of the experience of being in a 12-step fellowship. I came into contact with Felix because when Vanessa and I were speaking at an event together a couple of years ago in Paris, I said something about how I thought that what we needed, what was called for in the face of climate change and, you know, what we sometimes talk about under the heading of collapse or whatever, it doesn't matter so much right now what words we use, but what was called for is something like an AA for a whole culture. Something that I found myself saying coming out of the work with Dark Mountain over the years is, when we talk about the mess the world is in, and then we talk about sustainability, whatever sustainability starts out meaning, it always seems to end up meaning sustaining the ways of living of the Western middle classes at all costs, and the promise that that can be extended to everybody else. And so I found myself going around saying, you know, what's at stake is not sustaining this way of living, it's negotiating the surrender of this way of living. And so, Felix, when I was hearing you speak about that desire for the fix, the desire to fix everything and just take out the substances and then everything be fine, it reminds me of the thing that I've been trying to talk about there in terms of sustainability. Can I just ask you to switch your cameras back on, because it's so much nicer to be able to see people's faces, and the problem was that I was in the wrong room. Thanks, folks. I'm sorry about this rather terrible light that I'm under now, but one of the ways that I talk about what we did with Dark Mountain, or my experience of it, was that for a lot of people, and for those of you who don't know, Dark Mountain started with a manifesto that I wrote with a guy called Paul Kingsnorth about 12 years ago. And it became, both as a publication and in the events that we were holding, a place you go, particularly for environmentalists and activists, when everything had stopped making sense, when you no longer believed the things that you were expected to say in the meetings that you were part of, in the campaigns and groups that you were involved in. And you needed somewhere where you could bring your doubt or your fear or your despair or your uncertainty and know that you wouldn't be judged for it, and that there wouldn't be a rush to actions or to answers. And the thing that I've heard more often than anything else from people who got involved or came to events or found Dark Mountain is, I feel less alone because I've discovered the work that you guys are doing. But what I've seen over the last couple of years, and we could sort of date this to David Wallace Wells's The Uninhabitable Earth, the original magazine version of that, and then particularly from 2018 with Greta Thunberg and the school strikes and Extinction Rebellion, and many of the manifestations of the sort of new climate movements that we've seen, is something on a much larger scale than what we were doing with Dark Mountain that has a certain amount in common with it, because I'm seeing people who are brought to something that has the qualities of an initiatory experience by an encounter with the dark matter of climate change and collapse and the rest of it. And I think it's fair to say that it's mostly privileged white Western middle class people who I see this manifesting in above all. And it is sometimes articulated in ways that are kind of exasperating. But there's a truth in it, which is, the reason I say it's like an initiatory experience is because instead of dealing with climate change as a set of bad facts that we need to make plans and strategies about, what I see now is increasing numbers of people being called into question by the encounter with the knowledge of climate change, like having their whole story of who they are or who they thought they were, where we thought it was all headed, what kind of society we were living in, having all of that begin to unravel as you start to absorb these facts. And my question then is, how do we hold the space in which that kind of initiatory experience can happen? Because the getting broken part is the easy part of initiation. It's not the part that takes skill and knowledge and culture and practice. And I see a lot of the leading figures in the new climate movements modeling very powerfully what it is like to be broken, to be yourself in the kind of crisis that that can bring you to. But that's not the same thing as being equipped to hold the space that people need when your model gives them the permission to admit their own brokenness, to experience their own brokenness. And so that's quite, I think there's something dangerous there. And so that's a lot of the work that I'm trying to do at the moment, is bring some conversations around that together. And that's where the interest in AA comes in, because it seems to me to be the one large scale initiatory order to emerge from a modern Western cultural context. It's not role play. It's not a bunch of people going away for a shamanic retreat for a weekend. And it has to do with the price of entry. If you had a chance to read the essay from Lewis Hyde, which Felix and I shared, It's an essay that's nearly 50 years old. In some ways it's dated, but there's some stuff in there that I keep coming back to, especially that line where he says, alcoholism spreads when a culture is dying, just as rickets appear when there is no vitamin D. So addiction to alcohol and to other anesthetic, numbing substances is a symptom of cultural disease, of disease at the cultural level rather than the individual level. You know, my way of telling the story of modernity is to say modernity is founded on devastation, the devastation of the human worlds of culture and the more than human worlds of ecology. And I would say that environmental movements have been much better about speaking about the latter than about the former most of the time, maybe because it would confront a lot of the people in environmental movements with stuff that is more painful for them, for us, to address the cultural devastation, the devastation of, you know, modernity has been a bringer of death to the cultures of others, and also a way of being which lacks something of what it is to be a living culture in itself. In the essay, Hyde says, drawing very much on Ivan Illich, a culture faces and interprets pain, deviance, and death. It endows them with meaning. It illuminates how they're part of the whole and thereby makes them tolerable. And I think this has a lot to do with what I've been told by various people, which is, the work of culture is to produce grown-ups. Children are born, but grown-ups are made. And it is the work of culture to take our children and to create the spaces in which they have a chance of becoming grown-ups who can carry on the work of culture. And modernity tries to wipe all of that out as obsolete. It tries to numb pain. It tries to postpone growing up indefinitely. It is characterized by the avoidance of consequences. You know, I always say, like, the level of detachment from the consequences of your own actions and the cost of your own way of life that is normal, or in fact necessary, for participating in the societies that I've spent most of my life in and that many of us have spent much of our lives in. That level of detachment from consequences was, until very recently, the privilege of mad emperors. And now it's almost the cost of entry to being able to get out of bed in the morning and go to work. Because if you actually think about everything that is represented by the supply chains that stretch around the world in order for you to get through the day, you need a very heavy duty spiritual practice to be able to hold an awareness of that without falling apart. But the cost of initiation is unbearable and almost unthinkable to modernity. And there's one text that gave me some examples with which to think about this. Malidoma Some's book of Water and the Spirit. He comes from a Dagara tribe in Burkina Faso. He was abducted before he was 5 years old and taken to a Catholic boarding school. He escaped in his late teens and found his way back to his village. And slowly, gradually, the village had to decide what to do with this, this young man. And after a time, they made the decision that he should have the chance to go through the initiation that he would have gone through at around the age of 13 with the boys who were going through it that year. And there's so much in that book, but one detail that he doesn't even underline that stuck out to me is, in the story as he tells it, 60 of these adolescents go out. And they're out there for maybe 6 weeks with those who are responsible for their initiation. 56 of them return. Now, imagine if you say with every high school class where you've got like 30 kids going into their final exams, only 28 of them are going to come back. imagine filling out the risk assessment forms for that. And yet, in my mid-30s, I met up again with someone who'd been my best friend at the school I was at in the north of England between the ages of 11 and 13. And then I'd moved to a different school and we'd lost touch. And he was still living around there and he was working as an Anglican priest. And he said to me, do you know, in the last few years, I've seen 2 of our classmates buried in their 30s from alcohol-related diseases. So that toll is actually being taken in many of our communities. But the lessons, the work of initiation is rarely going on. So what strikes me about AA is what makes it have a chance of being real is that you don't arrive there without having burnt your life to the ground. Like the price of entry isn't that you bought a ticket for a weekend of immersing yourself in something that will feel more real and meaningful than your day job. The price of entry is that you have done enough damage that you have ended up there, very often to the people you cared most about. And something that Felix, you've mentioned to me is this thing within AA of you don't get to take a day off from your recovery because your addiction doesn't take a day off. And it's like, as I have conversations with people from AA, I don't want to romanticize it any more than I want to romanticize anything else. But I have the sense that if Hyde is right about alcoholism, or about alcohol as being sort of symptomatic of something going wrong with the ability of us to do the work of culture, and that being, as I say, it's something that characterizes modernity, then paradoxically, maybe there's a reverse engineering of this where AA is holding some particular clues for what it looks like to begin to rebuild the work of culture, starting from where we are rather than starting from where we might wish we were. I suppose the last piece that came to mind as I was preparing for this was, I was very struck a few months ago listening to Resmaa Menakem talking and saying, I don't talk about bodies of color, I talk about bodies of culture. And that phrase for me helped me see the connection between all of what I've been talking about here and the conversations about whiteness. That, as Felix said, that video that Vanessa shared with us was all about how, whiteness is the privilege of not having to grow up, of getting to act like a toddler and expect that other people are going to take care of you and explain everything to you and make you feel the way you want to feel, take away the pain. And maybe that is also kind of closely related to whiteness being an absence or a brokenness where the culture should be. And maybe part of composting whiteness and composting modernity is the hope that we might all be bodies of culture one day. But the cost of that, the cost of life is so damned high. I don't know how to go from the conversations I have with AA people who have been through what it's like to have your life burnt down into the conversations I have with climate activists, and work out, the things you have to see about yourself that you don't want to see in order to make that journey that is called for if we're going to all be bodies of culture one day. I don't know, it's one day at a time for me, and I am still learning how to make any kind of invitation that makes sense to help others. But that's what I have for this conversation tonight, I guess. Thank you for listening.
I will invite Mikoyo to respond.
I think one thing that often strikes me in a lot of these conversations is the high degree of species-centric self-importance. I think that, you know, when we start to talk about being out of lockstep with creation around us, there is a hugely humanocentric kind of undertone to how we maneuver these conversations. And I'm completely party to this, as I think if we are to acknowledge the role we've played collectively in not only the states that we are in ecologically, but as we interact with each other, there is this notion of the entitlement of our survival in mass, and the notion that our survival is somehow part and parcel to the planet surviving. And I know that might be considered a little bit nihilistic or dark, but it's just something that always strikes me in a lot of these conversations. But I guess that would just kind of be a kind of a precursorial kind of and I reconcile that a lot of that has to do with some notion around onus for the state that the planet is in, which is, I think, apropos. But I think that much of our solutions are based around this notion that it is our right, considering our poor stewardship, to still be in mass or functioning in the manner in which we have. That said, I found the initial kind of statement that Felix made about being a carbon addict a very interesting and profound one for several reasons. On a biochemical level, melanin is highly composed of carbon. I guess that can just hang there for a while. So when we start to talk about consumption and how we've gotten to this point, and the notion that, you know, we are talking about our perverse usage or our now perverted usage of mineral and what we think we need to sustain, frankly, our convenience. I also found Dugald's notion that, you know, what was once the territory of, you know, mad emperors being kind of par for the course now, very accurate notion. But I also think that there's a layer to that, you know, when we start to talk about modernity and these collapses, I still wonder how much of it is still very centered on our need to both own and distance ourselves from our role within this. Again, cursory impressions. I think that kind of the notion that, or at least the way that the information that kind of comes to us via many of these coltan and carbon-based mechanisms that relay our information for us, about who is involved in these movements around sustaining life is, like most things, highly affected by, frankly, white supremacist lens, because I think that there's a reality of things that are always afoot, both on a spiritual level and in practice, that is happening throughout the world that it was not be publicized in the same ways. But I think that there is also an acknowledgement of the fact that in a lot of older cultures that as a species, we have become decidedly parasitic in nature, and that's not and that's not specific solely to how whites or people who have bought into the lie of whiteness, if you will, are interacting with the planet. So I guess the question for me remains, and again, be it esoteric, be it rhetorical, is how important is the notion of humanity within this equation. And I acknowledge that there is, like I said, a direct onus in regards to the fallout, but I wonder if many of our attempts at solution have more to do with our addiction to our supposed entitlement towards being present at all. I am a father, so that may be a little bit, it's a difficult one as someone who has brought life on, into the world, or has been party to that particular componential exercise, if you will. But I also think that some of the notions around the lines that are drawn between childhood and adulthood are kind of interesting. You pointed out these kind of numbers about these initiation processes, right? Like the notion that 60 would go out and only 54 would come back. To me, per my particular existence and the numbers around that, sound like great numbers. But I think that what I'm saying is that if that could illustrate just how presumptive our notions are around returning from any undertaking might be, or what the cost, if you will, the blood price of survival of any group might actually be. I think those numbers in nature would be considered problematic just because of the fact that you would start to be dealing with a given group or species being out of lockstep with their given relationship to the other creatures that they are around. But I guess those would be my initial reactions. And I don't know how that lands for the group, but it's kind of secondary as a concern of mine, at best. As someone who has spent the better portion of my life in a space where we have to consider all kinds of other potentially obstructive dynamics, but who also had the supposed cultural dynamic of recycling being something that was part of my education very early on, and any number of other things. It is something that is interesting solely because of the fact that it is responsive in nature, as opposed to just a set of respectful choices around the environment that one is already a part of. And I think if we can kind of extrapolate out from there, the addiction to carbon predates modernity. And I think that, you know, some of the things that we are bemoaning in the now are, though very real, are at this point, I don't consider them unavoidable, but I do consider them perhaps part of the necessary acknowledgement that some degree of cull is going to be necessary for a healthier host. So yeah, that's pretty much all I got for right now.
Thank you, Mikoyo. We normally have a break at this point, and there's generally an invitation for people to do something during the break. So the last time it was to sip water and try not to consume it. We also had an invitation to go outside and breathe. Do you have an invitation?
That's all. That's the question for me, yes?
Yeah.
Ah. I like the notion of people taking a breath that is as deep as they possibly can, for it to be held there for no more than, let's call it 3 to 7 seconds. And for the release to be as slow and as intentional as possible.
I would add something, Vanessa. One of the things there's been like a million attempts by people at some point in everybody's recovery. The newcomers at some point in their first 3 years will go, aha, this is amazing. The whole of humanity needs this. You know, we need to start something like Humans Anonymous or whatever Anonymous. And at that point, there's an old timer, someone with 30 or 40 years in recovery who says, yeah, right. Okay, so listen, you need a rock bottom to do this shit. Like, you don't come here because you think it's an interesting experiment or you want to better yourself or you want to be more mindful. You come here because you are, you know, taking your babies to the crack house with you, or you're doing insane shit, like, and you're about to die. That's why you come here. So my question maybe for this pause for you guys is, what is rock bottom for you?
Thank you, Felix. So with an exercise of breathing and a question about rock bottom, we will be in recess for 9 minutes. We're coming back at 10 past the hour. I'll see you soon.